I want to move quickly through to the state. Our state budget situation, our state government is in a serious crisis mode, and it is a terrible, terrible mistake that they've made, which actually will end up costing you and I more money in the end. They ended up with a $14 billion deficit from a $140 billion budget, which is fairly shocking. In the sense, and the two causes of that were, first, they wagered on what they expected to be continued economic growth, specifically from housing and its allied markets. And a lot of that is you and here. The second thing that they also wagered on was the fact that people were going to start to sell off some of these things, and there's going to be some taxes, especially in the stock market, on the capital gains. And so there's some feeding on that as well. But in the end, it really is the first one that was the key. And this also happened, you may remember, in the earlier part of this decade, when the state budget really got hammered, and a lot of it was based on, well, we were betting on growth, and it didn't come through. And I don't know what happens at the Department of Finance in Sacramento, but it is a real tough time right there, right now. It's really tough. The key aspect of what's going on in the state of California in the budget is the fact that there's a trickle-down effect. A lot of cities and counties are going to feel the pinch because their funding, which is ultimately coming from the federal level, and now is going to have to be lost inside the state's general fund shuffle, is going to get squeezed even further. So what that means is that counties and cities are going to start scrambling more and more for sales tax dollars to try to figure out how they can change any kind of revenue structure they have, which may end up becoming more permitting fees, higher, and just taking on more, for example, parking meters may augment another quarter, which I still think is terrible. But anyway, the bottom line is that watch for that trickle-down effect. You're going to start seeing a lot of pinches in the county and city governments locally, and a lot of that's going to start to affect us trying to get around. Probably most likely it's going to affect transportation, parking, etc. The next slide I want to show you is sort of talk about this North Bay region and trying to think now at a more and more local level. It is likely that we're going to see a slowdown in this region. There's no doubt about that. The job numbers have come out and they are not looking good. The two key effects right now we're seeing are, one, the notices of default are rising very rapidly, and so the foreclosure rate rising quickly is signaling that there is a lot of financial trouble out there on the horizon. And this area, Sonoma County, for example, had their notices of default quadruple over 6 months last year. And so that historically was double what happened in 2006, even if you take out the seasonality. So that's a really fast surge in foreclosure, but we all know that that's happening. The key is, how do people react to that? If you lose your home or you have to move out of your home, if you're renting, that's great, in the sense that if you own a property that is a rental property, it may be a really good time for you, but how long will it last is the big key. Bottom line, though, is that anytime when somebody loses their home, they generally contract consumption because it puts a larger fear in them of the future, which then affects things like retail and personal services and professional services, which is the preponderance of our local economies. So there is that sort of multiplier effect happening in reverse because of that. However, the overall picture is not that bad. The local indicators show both a mix of growth and, especially in employment and income, but not as much. Oh God, now we have color change. One of those days. My baby was up at 2:30 last night, or in the morning. Well, it's now 7 hours ago, and so my eyes are seeing colors as it is. But the bottom line is that we're likely to see some support from employment and income growth, not necessarily going down, but flattening out and maybe growing a little bit, because wages still remain relatively high in this area. The key is whether or not unemployment and inflation rise simultaneously, and that's the stagflation issue I talked about before. When that happens, that generally leads to a mass amount of underconfidence for both investors and consumers simultaneously. And that word has still not crept into the language coming out of Washington yet. But I know the Federal Reserve has got to be thinking about that. I know Congress is thinking about that. I know the President's thinking about that it's leering over us very much. So let's look at some graphs and try to see these indicators.